Good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between George Will and Peter Tragos. Thanks for attending. FAN's a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 150 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for introductions. George Will writes a twice-weekly column on politics and domestic and foreign affairs for the Washington Post. He began his column with the Post in 1974, and he received the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 1977. He is also a regular contributor to MSNBC and NBC News. His latest book, American Happiness and Discontents, was released in September of 2021. Peter Tragos is the Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction at New Trier High School. He is a 26-year veteran educator who began his teaching career at Kenwood Academy in Chicago before coming to New Trier as a social studies teacher. Mr. Tragos leads several key initiatives relating to this district's strategic plan, and most recently, he facilitated the development of the Characteristics of a New Trier Graduate, which articulates the skills and dispositions students develop over the course of their four-year experience, and also the development and implementation of New Trier's Civil Discourse and Critical Thinking Statement. And now let's please welcome George Will and Peter Tragos.
Lonnie, terrific. What a great introduction. I appreciate that. And thank you to you and to FAN for bringing such excellent programming to our community. Mr. George Will, I am so pleased to be speaking with you tonight. What a great opportunity to talk with one of the most well-known and respected journalists in the country, who's had a front row seat to American politics for the last 50 years, and a front row seat to many Chicago Cubs games and Washington National games, I might add as well. I'm eager to talk to you tonight about your latest book, American Happiness and Discontents, the Unruly Torrent 2008 to 2020 that I so enjoyed reading, and I'm eager to speak with you tonight about your insights on the last 13 years in our nation's history. If I might, let me try to make a small world connection as a segue to my first question, if I might, that I mentioned. So in the introduction to your book, you recount the story of how you first came to Washington, D.C., lured away from the University of Toronto by Senator Gordon Allott of Colorado, who was looking for a Republican academic to write for him as one of his staff writers as he took on the policy position in the Republican ranks. Well, fast forward 20 years to the late 1980s, from the time you took that job with Senator Allott to the time I was in Des Moines, Iowa at Drake University with a fellow student named Gordon Allott III, who was the senator's grandson. And he and I were friends through college and continue a friendship today. And in fact, he may be on this webinar today as well. And he recounts meeting you actually at his grandfather's funeral in 1989, and recall that fondly when I shared this with him. So with that, I just wanted to make that small world connection to think about where we've been in our very different paths in life, that the connection to Senator Allott, which is really the question here. Why did you accept that job from Senator Allott to leave the University of Toronto? And then maybe more significantly, why did you stay in Washington, D.C.? What kept you there for 50 years? So maybe both parts of those questions, certainly the second half. Why did you stay, and why have you stayed 50 plus years?
Before getting to either of those, let me say there's an Illinois connection in this. I am, of course, from Central Illinois, from Champaign-Urbana. Went to Uni High, the University of Illinois High School. My father taught at the University of Illinois. The reason I got to Washington was in September, I believe it was, 1969, Everett Dirksen, the senator from Illinois, who was then minority leader of the Senate, leader of the Senate Republicans, died. He was from Pekin, Illinois. You may not know that Pekin was named, no one knows why, after Peking, China. And the high school teams at that time were known as the Pekin Chinks, which gives you some idea of how much we've changed in our country, I think, for the better. Anyway, Gordon Allott was elected when they shuffled the leadership after Dirksen died. Gordon Allott, of whom I'd never heard, was elected chairman of the policy committee. He said, I want to hire a Republican academic to write for me. This was 1969. There were no Republican academics, rather like today. But through serendipity, he heard about me in Toronto, and I was tantalized. I left Toronto going to Washington, intending to come back. Toronto made clear that there'd be no problem with me taking leave and coming back. But very few people go to Washington, turn around and leave. There are a lot of reasons for that, but it's an exciting, beautiful city. And if you respond to the symbolism of American life, it's chock full of wonderful reminders of our history. And that's why I stayed. I liked what I was doing. I had gone to Princeton, I'd gone to Oxford and then went to Princeton, training to be and intending to be, and briefly was, a professor of political philosophy. I thought, and I think I was right, I say 50 years on, that I could do political philosophy in the pages of newspapers. That is, I could try to connect daily events with larger principles. And that's why I stayed.
That's great. It really a terrific story. And I think that, my reading of that, not only in this book, but in your work, really does trace that contemporary issues and ideas. And I think what I see you doing, and I hope we'll talk about tonight, is just how you've drawn or connected the dots of what's happening today with its historical roots in a way that really history does matter. And you also quote this in your introduction too, and believe it or not, something I've used in my social studies classes and history classes as well. You quote from William Faulkner's Requiem for a Nun that the past is never dead. It's not even the past. And really a powerful notion of the way history lives in the present, and really a great setup to your book as well. And thinking about your book, I want to ask you a couple questions about the bookends of the time period in this. So your book is bookended by the start of Obama's presidency and the end of Trump's presidency. We tend to mark historical time or political time in presidential administration. Certainly not the only way to mark time, but it is a useful way in doing so. And I think you've even talked about maybe that method of marking time perhaps overstates the relative importance of any one president, and understanding that. But in any case, it does confine the scope of this book to that time period. So I'm curious about why focus on this time period right now as you look back on the last 13 years, and perhaps what's different or unique about this time period versus other torrents or tumults in American history, if you will.
I focused on this period because we had, I think, a great surge of hope with the election of Barack Obama. It closed a chapter in American history. It opened a vista. It was a great moment for African Americans in America. And it ended with the defeat of Donald Trump after a presidency that was, I try not to talk about it. I write about it very little. People who, if you want a book that talks about Donald Trump, don't buy mine, because he's not in there very much. I don't think he's that important, and I know he's not that interesting. I think this was the period, let's put it this way. Historians will not identify this 12-year period as the era of good feelings 2.0. Mm-hmm. We are at daggers drawn, we're dyspeptic, we're intemperate, we're ferociously angry. The large number of Americans seem to be happy only when they're unhappy. They seem to feel only alive when they're furious at someone or something. I don't think this is by any means a majority of Americans. There are 330 million people in this country today. And at any given moment, 325 million of them are not listening to talk radio and not watching cable television. They're getting on with life and getting along with their neighbors. But there is a tone-setting function, I'm afraid, I'm sorry to say, of that minority that deals with politics all day long. People whose lives are oriented around political choices. I think that's profoundly unhealthy. A good society is a society in which people think about politics occasionally and temperately, and then move on. The absorption of life by politics is a sign not of a healthy society, but of the reverse.
Very interesting. I'm curious about the hyper focus on politics all time as opposed to some of the time, as you say. What accounts, I mean, what in your observations, being in DC, writing about this, observing it, looking at other historical periods, what is it about this particular time period that so many are so focused all the time on these politics, and perhaps politics as blood sport, right? Not as a contest of ideas, but maybe even as to go so far as to, as you said, daggers drawn. What accounts for that in your observation and what you're seeing and hearing in Washington?
I wish I could account for it.
Yeah.
I got to Washington on the first day of the first year of the 1970s. I drove into town on January 1st, 1970. This was a very different town. Now, this is in part because the two parties had not sorted themselves out into ideological camps.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1950s and 1960s, political scientists said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have a more tidy politics? We'd have a liberal party and a conservative party, and people would go their own ways. Well, we've got that, and is everyone happy? I don't think so. When I came to Washington to work on the Republican minority side of the Senate was run by Richard Russell of Winder, Georgia, James Eastland of the Mississippi Delta, the Judiciary Committee. Armed Services was John Stennis of Corinth, Mississippi. Labor and Education was John McClellan of Little Rock, Arkansas. Sparkman of Alabama. Irvin of North Carolina. The Senate was run by conservative, mostly segregationist in 1970, still Southern Democrats. That was not a good thing, but there was this byproduct. People had to talk to one another and deal with people they didn't agree with, or you couldn't deal with the Senate. I remember during the nomination contest for the Democratic nomination in 2020, some people, notably his current vice president, got all over Joe Biden because they said, you dealt with these segregationists. And Biden said sensibly and accurately, they were there. This was part of the American landscape, and I dealt with it. So it was a very different country.
Yeah, interesting to think about it, which is what I was thinking about, and maybe you've answered it somewhat. Is it so? I think about these kinds of differences, and know this as a student of history and a teacher of history. The times you're talking about, I think, back to Jefferson's first inaugural address in 1800 after the bitter tie, and emerging from the House of Representatives after the tie in the Electoral College, in which he noted in his conciliatory inaugural address that not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle. We are all Republicans and we are all Federalists. I wonder how that plays out today. It almost seems a little nostalgic to think about that as a bygone era. That I wonder if you're seeing and thinking about the national discourse and politics being more honest and perhaps even more civil at that time that you're referencing in the early 70s when you got there.
Well, I won't pause over the fact that I think Jefferson was being, as was his wont, more surreptitiously political.
Fair enough.
We were not all Republicans. We were not all Federalists.
Fair enough.
The 1970 campaign was probably as bitter and scurrilous as any in our history. But Jefferson was leading the facts to be healing, and it was a statesman-like thing for him to say. Mm-hmm. I do think that people get weary of anger. They get weary of the tone of life. And again, the vast majority of Americans, when they think of politics at all, which is rarely, they think with a kind of sigh, and they wish people would behave in a more adult manner. And I think we'll get back to that. Just as Mr. Trump demonstrated the power of one prominent figure to change for the worse the national temper. I think the lesson of that is that surely a prominent political leader of a different stripe could affect a similar and opposite change. So really, it's up to the American people to insist upon that. I'm sure some of our listeners are almost as old as I am, and they can remember the comic strip in the 1950s and 1960s, Pogo, drawn by Walt Kelly. And Pogo famously said, "We have met the enemy and he is us." We tend always to allow the American people to escape judgment. The American people are part of the problem.
So you sounded, that there's a ray of hope in there, that we can emerge from this. But so, one way out is through, and that where we are in
quoting Robert Frost.
Yes, and one way out is through. In looking at the American poet Robert Frost, indeed. The right now it seems we are so focused on the things we read, we see, we hear, are focused on these things that divide us: culture, politics, education. And what I see, and I'm interested to, and I think you've written about too, and interested to hear what you have to say about some of these things, is that we tend to categorize people as all one thing or all another, and then our differences, be that as they may, get framed as dichotomies, right? And just really stark contrasts of elite versus anti-intellectual, patriotic versus un-American. Pick your issue, and there's a dichotomy for that. And I wonder if you think about those things, and we're talking about this a little bit now, are those old or new divisions about that? And are they just the natural part of ongoing conversations about what it means to be American, over time, or in this one time, or are we witnessing something entirely new, do you think?
First, what we're seeing today is the death of two cliches, and it's about time they died.
Mm-hmm.
One of which was Tip O'Neill's famous statement, "All politics is local." Not today. All
Mm-hmm.
politics is national. If you look at the Virginia race for governor, national issues filtered in.
Yeah.
How we what we teach, how we teach history, and all the rest. And the second cliche is Americans vote their pocketbooks. That's a disparaging thing to say about them. It simplifies the American people to say that they have a kind of mental adding machine and they calculate their economic well-being. The American voter is much more complicated than that. And I think the American people almost never vote their pocketbook. Maybe in 1932, when the economy had collapsed and unemployment was 24%. But generally, the American people vote a rounded, more adult, more humane sense of national welfare.
Really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, certainly both of those resonate in Tip O'Neill's, all politics is local. Great examples of maybe how that's changed, and perhaps that's media, the proliferation of 24-hour news. I mean, all of those things, make us less local than perhaps we were before. Changing gears just a little bit, in that I was interested in your chapter on parenting, and in that it's a chapter that includes other things besides parenting, but it's the chapter titled "Skirmishes in the Culture War," which includes topics of parenting, which you interestingly note, parent or parenting has shifted from a noun to a verb in recent times. And it includes other topics such as history and race and mascots at a professional level and a collegiate level as well. You've actually just referenced Pekin, Illinois mascot as well. And that chapter about the culture wars in parenting precedes your chapter on the university titled "Peculiar Goings On in the Groves of Academia." And I assume there's no coincidence to their adjacency, and one precedes the other in that. So I'm interested in their adjacency and how one precedes the other. And then the question is this to think about. So your father was a college professor. You're an academic by all accounts, a student of history, and yet you're critical of the university in your book and in your writings recently. You reference things like the supply and demand for knowledge, standardized tests, First Amendment, and these things. So I'm curious to know just the relationship between those two big chapters, and then what is it about the state of the university today that warrants its own section with 23 different articles on the university. So interested to hear what you're thinking about and what you've been seeing and thinking about that.
Well, I am the child of academia. I'm a faculty brat. I intended to be, and as I say, briefly was an academic. I've had the great fortune of having now degrees from two of the top 10 universities in the world, Oxford and Princeton University. I believe that the great world research universities that have evolved through 800 years of ecclesiastical and political thickets to emerge in the 20th century as the greatest ornaments, and I'm speaking carefully, the greatest ornaments of Western civilization, are in danger of kicking all this away in a generation or two, as they're taken over by people who think their job is not the transmission of the Western culture, because a lot of them think the Western culture is not worth transmitting, but rather succumbing to a kind of political agitprop. I'll get to that in a second, but I want to, that's where I'm going. Where I'm starting is back with the verb parenting. The fact that the noun became a verb was, I think, symptomatic of this. We decided there was a theory out there called parental determinism. And it was that parenting is a complex science, complex activity, rather like differential calculus. And that if you master this skill, and if you do it with great determination, you can produce awesome children. And they will be clay in your hands. And if you do it right, they'll go on to Princeton or Goldman Sachs or wherever you want them to go. Well, anyone who's had children and actually looked at their children knows that's not true. The children have their own trajectory and their own velocity. That parents affect this, of course they do. They're terribly important. We want parents to pay attention. But when you get this theory that children are soft wax in the hands of their parents, and that parental determinism will shape everything, you tend to get minute micromanagement of childhood. I remember growing up in Champaign, Illinois, in the late 40s and early 1950s. In the summer, I'd get up and we'd barge out the back door, and my mother would say, "Come back at lunch if you're hungry. If not, we'll see you at dinner." And we had 8 hours of unsupervised play, this swarm of children of different ages, different interests. We'd have collaborative play, we'd have squabbles, we'd have fights, we'd have injuries, we'd work it out by ourselves. And I think that was called growing up. Nowadays, we have helicopter parents, the minute management of children who are given very little unsupervised play to work out life and learn how to cope. And I cannot help but think that this has something to do with the fact that we now have people coming to college, young people demanding not freedom of speech, but freedom from speech that might distress them. They want safe spaces where they can cower while biased response teams from the university administration fan out about the campus to stamp out microaggressions and other upsetting things. How did we produce young people who feel so threatened and brittle? And I think it's alarming because it feeds, that's why the two chapters, as you acutely know, are related, from parenting to the current distressful behavior on campuses.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting about the freedom from speech, longstanding debate about the First Amendment, right? In all contexts, thinking about both, freedom of speech as well as freedom from speech. Could talk about, what's happening on campuses as you've observed it and researched it and written it, that is there any speech that might be fettered, or, at the university level, a voluntary place of young adults, is it unfettered there? And thinking about, because this is certainly a topic of the day, and looking at universities today, and you note some specific schools and universities as well, thinking about that. So any thoughts on that?
My default position is all speech is permitted. If someone wants to suppress speech, let them make the case and let them enunciate a principle that says why this should be suppressed. For example, if I say something, or anyone says something, and another person says, that makes me unhappy, or that hurts my feelings, or that upsets my convictions, the answer to that is too bad. You came to college, which is supposedly an arena of free expression and free inquiry and free discourse. If this upsets you, go back to your room, collect your belongings, go home, get into bed, pull up the covers, and stay there until the world is ready to embrace you and cosset you with a blanket of caring. The world's not like that. The world is full of people with different opinions, and the world is full of sharp edges. Get over it. Now, I know, again, that runs against the spirit of modern parenting, but that's the point. Young people come to college and they feel suddenly unsafe. Well, college isn't supposed to be a safe place in that sense. College should be disturbing. College should be a place where your fundamental orientation gets held up to the bright light of dissent and
And does that speech then, we talked about, and you're talking about, having a discourse of ideas, right? And that, in what ways does this kind of, unfettered free speech impede any productive kinds of conversations? I wonder, you paint the picture of, pack up your belongings and do this. Is that actually the outcome that we're seeking in this, or can we also have a free speech and exchange of ideas?
Of course we do. But if you say we're going to have free speech as long as it doesn't upset people, you've lost the battle right there, because someone's always going to be upset.
Yeah.
And that's just too bad. The world is that way. Welcome to our world, which is full of people who have different views about the great norms of life.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I appreciate it. Also, in this chapter 2, I want to talk a little bit about, you talk about a couple areas related to the SAT and a meritocracy. And I'm curious about your thinking about it and the things you've been writing about and researching related to a meritocracy in that section about the SAT. So I'm curious, what do you think about the SAT? You write it in relationship to the adversity index, quote unquote, the adversity index that came out a couple of years ago with SAT. Do you think that the SAT in its original intent was to open or democratize the university has lived up to its original intent, or perhaps by providing a ladder for social mobility? Or do you think it's a myth today?
Let's not.
Maybe it's more nuanced than that too.
Let's not tiptoe around the facts. The SAT was invented to get Jews into Harvard. That's part of what it was for. Harvard, until the 1930s, was a mediocre institution. It existed to take the well-bred boys from St. Paul's and Groton and Bluefield and Choate and the rest, the sons of Harvard, if you will, and educate them. And along came, at about age 40, in 1943, James Conant. James Conant was to have a great career before and after. After, he was actually at Alamogordo when the first atomic bomb exploded. He was science advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. But James Conant said, enough, we're going to make Harvard into an elite, properly elite, admirably elite institution. And we're going to do this by decreasing the value of legacies, being the child of an alum or being the scion of a great fortune. We're going to have objective measurements, and therefore we're going to have a scholastic aptitude test, which frankly, over the years, has indeed demonstrated great predictive power about the ability to flourish in an elite academic institution. So Harvard did this in part, again, let's face these facts, to knock down the quota system that held down the number of Jews in the Ivy League. And it worked. Now, people say today, well, yes, we like a meritocracy, but it's not somehow equal. And of course it's not. We now know that there are lots of ways to transmit family advantages. Probably the least diverse classes in the United States today are SAT prep classes. But we actually want families to be concerned about passing on their advantages. We want families to be concerned about nurturing their children and giving them momentum towards success. Now, does that mean we're going to have an unequal effect? Of course it does. The idea that you can produce perfect equality of opportunity is, I'm sorry, fanciful.
Yeah, it's In both of those articles and chapters, very interesting to think about the role of the SAT and its original intent and where it ends today. And, you know, when you think about just different ways of passing on advantages or privileges, as you talked about in prep classes and that. And we see many schools today, whether it's a response to COVID in the last year and a half, who are moving to be more test optional, to look at holistic measures of students. And, you know, perhaps that's the direction we're headed. And in doing so, wonder what you think about that, if that's something you've been looking at too, and reading about and also writing about as well.
Well, you just used one of the magic phrases that is an issue in some litigation that's heading to the Supreme Court.
Yep.
As a result of a group of Asian American students suing Harvard over what they say, I think indisputably correctly, that Harvard discriminates against Asian Americans. And Harvard does so, and a lot of schools do so, but Harvard particularly, by saying, well, we're taking a holistic approach to examining these people. What that means is we're not just looking at the so-called objective metrics, and there are, I know, problems with this, high school transcripts and standardized tests. They're saying we're going to look at holistically, inevitably produces a kind of stereotyping. Now, this was used against Jews for a long time. They said, well, Jews are in a holistic examination. They're just not quite our kind of people, Harvard said. And not just Harvard, the Ivy League generally. Well, during the discovery in this case that's working it toward the Supreme Court, a document came forward that said the following. This was from the Harvard admissions department. If we admitted solely on the base of these two objective metrics, standardized tests and high school transcripts, we would have an entry-level class that was 43% Asian American and 1% African Americans. Now, I understand Harvard saying we don't want our class to look like that. And I don't think most of us want elite institutions to look like that. But once you deviate from that, look out. Because once you say we're going to have a holistic assessment, people are free to discriminate by whatever standards they create. And it's dangerous. I'm not saying there's an easy way out of this. I'm just saying it's problematic any way you go.
Right. Certainly no easy way. But you know, the complexity. Go ahead.
Harvard could fill its freshman class several times over just with people who got 1600s on the SAT. Now I'm talking to an audience tonight with a large number of people from New Trier High School, right?
Yep.
An elite high school, one of the nation's best. And I know that there are young people in the North Shore of Chicago scribbling away on their application essays. I've been through this with 3 children, and I know it isn't fun. My hat's off to and my commiseration to all the parents involved in this. But once you say, well, we're going to abandon the instruments of meritocracy, which are standardized tests and transcripts and all the rest, look out, because once you sever yourself from the meritocratic aspiration, people are free to allocate opportunity in the United States on the basis of various dubious and sometimes toxic metrics.
Well, this is you know, really something interesting, because I think we're seeing the move towards that, right? We're seeing the move towards these holistic, the way you've described them as well, but also in looking at students' potential beyond any one standardized test score that have the possibility and the propensity for success at the university level.
Let me interrupt you. Up here to just say, for example, in suburban Maryland and suburban Virginia, Northern Virginia, in the affluent suburbs of Washington, there's Thomas Jefferson High School, an elite high school with rigorous admissions. The school board in this county has been moving to end the standardized tests because, and they're almost this blunt in saying it, too many Asian Americans are being admitted. Now, Do you want to discriminate against people on the basis of their race and ethnicity or not? This school board wants to. I don't want to. This is happening in New York with the selective schools. Wonderfully, the new mayor of New York, soon to be mayor of New York, Mr. Adams, has said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to end the selectivity of Bronx High School of Science and some of the other great schools that are selective in their admissions. San Francisco, you will not be surprised to know, has gone the other way, trying to abolish the selectivity. But America has to make a decision. Are we against meritocratic measures to enable people to rise? You quoted a moment ago, and I noted you quoting it, Robert Frost. Robert Frost said something else. He said, I do not want to live in a homogenized society. I want the cream to rise. America is going to have to say, do we want the cream to rise or not? If you say that, then you have to say there is some people are part of the cream and some aren't. I'm sorry. That sounds undemocratic, unegalitarian. It sounds elitist. Well, I'm an elitist. I'm for elites.
It does sound all of those things, and I, respect your thinking on these matters. But certainly, it does sound that way as I hear it.
It's supposed to sound that way. The question is not ever should elites rule. The question is which elites are going to rule. And
that's been a historical question for many, many years, right? For decades.
I'd say for at least 4 millennia.
Yeah.
But surely the test of democracy is to get consent to worthy elites. And the end of democracy, the end of civilization is when people say, we don't like elites. We don't like this idea that some people are better than others. I'm sorry, some people are better than others at writing novels, at construing poetry, about judging. Some people are better than others at hitting baseballs. And the fact is, we want the cream to rise.
Nevin, let me ask change topic slightly. Same ballpark, a different question about the value of historical literacy as critical to a democracy. You've talked about this a little bit too, and mentioned this earlier. In all of your writing, you really do historicize the present, and then when you're writing about historical topics, really try to shed a light or draw a line through history to the present in this way. And thinking about, why do historical literacy as a fundamental understanding to a robust democracy, and yet we're in a contest over the teaching of history at this very moment. So I'm curious about what you've seen and what you're thinking about, both as the importance of historical literacy and understanding to a robust democracy, as well as the teaching of history as a flashpoint today. As well.
I sent 3 children through colleges, 1 to Northwestern right down the road from you, and 2 to Princeton. And I said to all of them, when I'm dictator of America, the only permissible major is going to be history. So of course, none of my 3 college-bound students majored in history.
Right. Tell your students what to do, and they will, or your children what to do, and they won't do it. So there you go.
It's the very end of the axiom: if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans.
Yeah.
But Orwell said in 1984, he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. Therefore, we are arguing about how to teach history, what history means. Well, I subscribe to the famous doctrine that history is philosophy teaching by example. As a columnist, someone who comments on current affairs, I am just staggered by and appalled by, and my life is complicated by historical illiteracy, because one would like to be able to assume a certain mental pantry full of ideas and information when one writes, as I'm confined to 750 words per column, about these complicated matters. Now, here, can I say something about columnizing? Because it's relevant to this. The majority of American people do not read newspapers. And only a minority of the minority of newspaper readers read the op-ed pages, read columns. Now that depresses a lot of columnists. I find it exhilarating because what it means is we are getting a small, self-selected, intellectually upscale group of readers about whom we can assume a certain level of opinion and information and interest and historical knowledge, which makes it much easier to write about complicated issues if you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you sit down to talk about a subject. That's why I think it's terribly important to have people who can laugh at some of the nonsense we currently hear about American history.
Yeah, it's at one, as you call for greater historical literacy and understanding, and the patience that comes with that, and the patience and the time and reading and open-mindedness and the exploration of what historians over time and currently have had to say. I think there's also, in my observations, there's kind of a disdain of that history right now, or at least the university that we're talking about, right? The critique, the skepticism of academics or of elites that you were talking about, that they don't know and they shouldn't have this kind. So there is that strand of anti-intellectualism as well, which kind of counteracts your call for more historical literacy. How do we reconcile those things? Because as a former history teacher and historian, yes, I mean, that is exactly, historicizing the present is essential to understanding our present condition as being, impacted or influenced. It does live in the present, as we opened up and started to talk about. So how do we reconcile both of those things?
Teach history. Let's get people to read it, know what happened, when and where. I mean, it's before we decide to theorize about American history, let's teach people that the Battle of Gettysburg happened in the first 3 days of July in 1863. That's kind of important to know, that Shiloh preceded it, that Cold Harbor succeeded it. Know things, facts. I know facts are considered boring, and the rote mastery of details is considered suppressing the free flowering of individual creativity. Good, just who cares? Master the details. You can get to your theorizing later, but first find out what happened.
Yeah, and in finding out what happened, I think we've seen, and you've read over time, and different historians have used similar evidence to draw different conclusions and thinking about historical, and that's an important part of historical understanding. Is there's an interpretation element or construct that's really important to understand, that historians over time have had a set of facts, as over time there have been more information comes into that from documents that have been discovered, ideas that have been discovered, and that is all part of that narrative of history, I guess, is what I'm getting at. I think as you think about that, is reading those perspectives as well as part of the historian's job is to interpret what those things mean, not just learning rote facts as well. So any thoughts?
Sure. Let's take an example of how facts come first.
Yeah.
As part of the New York Times 1619 project, one of the great themes was that the American Revolution was fought because Americans were afraid of losing their slaves. Now, this strikes me as a libel against American history, but that's my opinion. Not even opinion, facts refute it, just facts. For example, they say, well, the American Revolution was fought because Lord Dunsmore of Virginia, the colonial governor, had said that slaves fleeing their masters and joining the British forces would be emancipated. And that caused the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. Well, the Stamp Act happened before that. The Boston Tea Party happened before that. The Boston Massacre happened before that. Lexington and Concord happened before that. The appointment of George Washington, these are all facts.
Right.
George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army before that. And so to say that that was the cause of the American Revolution is factually preposterous.
And as an interpretation, you would want us to read, and I'm guessing students to read this. This is what historical interpretations do. It's an historical fact. The events of 1619 are an historical fact. Those things happened. a slave ship arrived in the Virginia colony. Those are historical facts. The interpretations really to understand history, to understand the narratives of history, to be a thinker of history, is to understand how historians draw different conclusions. Is that fair to say in your estimation?
Of course.
And I think we see that dialogue happening. We see historians, I mean, now more than ever, historians are actually in the news. People are talking about not only history and the teaching of history, how it's written, which is historiography, and talking about what historians do. We have this kind of inner dialogue, or this conversation happening among historians that was pretty reserved, that was mostly reserved for academics, now has become very popularized, and it takes some patience and understanding to that.
What I am saying is, though, start with a bedrock of fact, so you know something. If A precedes B, you can't say that B caused A. That is, if the revolution started before Lord Dunsmore's proclamation, you can't say Lord Dunsmore's proclamation caused the war. That's all. That's fact.
Let me ask, as we round third, if I can use a baseball analogy and come home, I've got one last question for you, and then I definitely would be remiss if we didn't talk a little baseball and little sports. So after your observations, kind of your time in Washington, D.C., and the things you've been writing and thinking and reading, and you've talked about our present moment as well. Are you feeling optimistic about the future of America, or are you pessimistic?
Well, there's a phrase called pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I think we have a sort of duty to be optimistic about the future, to be good citizens. Mm-hmm. I think there are abundant reasons to be pessimistic. Our founders read assiduously the history of republics. Before Madison, my pinup, he's the wallpaper on my smartphone. Before Madison, who, by the way, was the first graduate student at Princeton, where I was a graduate student, before Madison went to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to superintend the Constitutional Convention, he asked his good friend, Thomas Jefferson, who was in Paris, to send him a trunk load of books. Jefferson did, and Madison read them. A book published, two books, great books of the Western world, were published in 1776. One was The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, optimistic, cheerful understanding of a cooperative volunteer market society. The other was the first volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. My connection with that is Gibbon was a student at Magdalen College, Oxford, where I, 2 centuries later, was a student. So our framers were steeped in the perilous history of republics, the great sense of fragility, the perishable nature of free governments. And so they were, in a sense, there was a pessimistic streak in them, but pessimism is not fatalism. Pessimism is wariness. Pessimism is an acute understanding of danger, not a surrender to it. But these intelligent pessimists produced a government that has, let's give it its due, has long endured. Mm-hmm. Take Lincoln's words at Gettysburg.
It's great. Good. Thank you. I appreciate that, and hearing that is as well. I'm an optimist too, and I like to hear that, and I'd like to think we can make our way through this particular time and the things we've been talking about in doing this. I do want to take a couple minutes, if I can. I'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little baseball and sports. So I have to ask, how is it in a book about happiness and discontent the Chicago Cubs don't make the cut in your book?
Well, I've written 3 of my 16 books are on baseball. One of them is a nice little place on the north side.
I know, I'm familiar.
Wrigley Field at 100. One of my baseball books, which is either the first or second best-selling baseball book of all time, called Men at Work, The Craft of Baseball, published in 1990. It has sold more than my other 15 books combined, which I take as a sign of national health, that people are much more interested in baseball than in politics. Baseball, like everything else in this world, has its problems. Baseball has some really serious ones.
Yeah.
I think they'll deal with them. And of course, the Cubs have their problems right now.
Yes, they do. Happiness in 2016 fits into the window. Discontent for the last years since the World Series there. So, well, I appreciate the time and conversation. I know Lonnie's going to come on just about right now in doing this. So I'll say my conclusion and formal farewell in just a moment here, but turn it over to Lonnie at this time. So, Lonnie?
Gentlemen, thanks for a very interesting conversation. We have some lively questions in the Q&A. I want to remind everyone that Mr. Will and Mr. Tragos will be doing about a 30-minute after hours that'll begin 5 minutes after this closes. So about, if you're in Central Time, that'll be 8:05 p.m. If you're on the East Coast, that's 9:05 p.m. Mr. Will, I did send along the link as you had instructed me earlier. So just as FYI. You can get into After Hours by buying a copy of Mr. Will's new book from our bookseller, The Bookstall. We've been putting in links in the chat to do that, and we hope to see some of you. It's a nice casual gathering, and people can ask their own questions. So I'm going to go with, we'll start with the most popular question that was posed. People get to upvote questions. Mr. Plank, Steve Plank asks, I was interested in Mr. Will's comments on freedom of speech versus freedom from speech. I followed his comments on why it's dangerous or counterproductive to try to protect people from microaggressions. Where is the line, though, to guard against the power dynamics that have stood for too long? Males, white people, those who from the establishment have been able to devalue or belittle others in our educational institutions for hundreds of years. I worry about microaggressions or educational settings that make persons of color, women, or others feel that the game is stacked against them. Would Mr. Will care to comment on this?
Yes, surely the answer to this is freedom of speech. It is argument. It is the great rhetoric. The walls, the biggest walls of injustice in the United States were brought down by words, by rhetoric, by the freedom of speech of Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and John Lewis and others. It was speech that did it. You can say, well, we're all for free speech, except when? We're all for free speech other than here. We're all for free speech if we'll have the following regulations. No, if you all have these codicils that follow your endorsement of free speech, you're generally not in favor of freedom of speech. And you just ought to say so. Look, all kinds of people through the ages have argued against freedom of speech. Join them and we'll have a free speech argument about that.
Yeah.
What does get wearisome is the idea that I'm for free speech, except, well, I'm not really.
Do you see, can I ask something there, Lonnie, too, in this, I didn't get a chance to ask this, Mr. Will, do you see a difference in the K-12 environment compared to the university that you're talking about?
Yes, a little bit. The Supreme Court has wrestled with this in the Tinker case coming out of Des Moines with freedom of speech. And Justice Brennan saying they do not check their rights at the schoolhouse door. Certainly, as young people become young adults and become more mature in their ability to weigh and judge and discuss, you make adjustments. There's a sliding scale. So what's appropriate for kindergarten is not appropriate for 8th grade, and what's appropriate for 8th grade is not appropriate to seniors in high school. And seniors in high school are not appropriate perhaps for college. If you have a sliding scale, it requires judgment. But what I'm arguing is that the default position should be in favor of freedom of speech, and the case against it must be made. This free speech is innocent until proven guilty.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Lisa is asking about, she wants to circle back to your standardized test conversation. She says, not sure how you can call standardized tests meritocracy based, since it has been shown that higher scores are directly tied to higher socioeconomic status.
Yes, but the question is, what does that prove? It undoubtedly proves that the ability of families to transmit their advantages is real. That doesn't demonstrate that what the families transmit does not demonstrate a predictive aptitude for flourishing in college. Now, you may say that it's unjust because not everyone starts equally. Well, that's true, No one ever has, in no society has everyone started equally. And we don't want a society that discourages people from trying to give their children a leg up. Again, I know I'm talking to the North Shore of Chicago, where I think people work hard at giving their children a leg up. And I'm not going to join the chorus in trying to make them feel guilty about doing so.
I mean, a lot of people are kind of responding back to some of what you're saying there. Kathy says, it seems to me that you don't need to oppose the rule of elites to wonder how to recognize the great minds who haven't had the money or training to get to Harvard. It seems to me that this is more the issue than stopping recognition and coddling of the elite.
I understand that. For 4 years, I was a trustee of Princeton University, Princeton then and now, devotes an enormous amount of time and energy to sending admissions personnel people to high schools that have traditionally not been visited by Ivy League admissions personnel, to the complex, difficult, but not insoluble problem of finding out how to throw the net out and sieve in talent that might otherwise have been neglected. The Ivy League has long since gone way beyond recruiting from Choate, Groton, and Deerfield and St. Paul's. That's 50 years out of date. And all the Ivy League schools I know are doing what Princeton does, which is work very hard to find talent wherever it may be.
I'm
But
going to shift.
What you don't want to do as you're out hunting for talent is to say, well, the answer to this is to define talent down, to say that we're not really after talent, we're about something else. No, we're not. We're after talent. We just have to be more assiduous in finding it.
Thank you for that. I'm going to shift topic here. We have about 1 minute left, so this might be the last question. It's from Jeffrey Emmerich. He says, can we shift toward current politics and how we move toward a Congress that works to solve problems for the American people? History shows that this is possible, but we are so far from being there in 2021.
Well, we go through these phases, but I would urge people to stop saying, gee, nothing gets done in Washington. We've just passed a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. People said, yes, but Barack Obama couldn't get anything done. Nonsense. Barack Obama passed with Dodd-Frank the largest revision of financial regulation since the 1930s. And with the Affordable Care Act, Barack Obama passed the most important addition to social legislation in this country since 1965, since Medicare and Medicaid. So things do get done in Washington. It's hard, but it's supposed to be hard. The framers of the Constitution said, we're going to make it difficult for the government to move quickly because when governments move quickly, the results are often not good. So they went to Philadelphia and produced a complicated government. These were not simple men. They did not do simple-minded things. They said, we're going to have 3 branches of government, 2 branches of the legislative branch, each with its own electoral rhythm and constituency, veto overrides, supermajorities, judicial review, all kinds of ways to slow it down. But I've been in Washington now 52 years, I know of nothing the American people have wanted intensely and protractedly that they didn't get.
Great point. Actually, I concur with that. Peter, thank you so much for an excellent interview, excellent preparation. We're grateful to your service to FAN and to the community. Mr. Will, it's been a pleasure getting to spend this 60 minutes with you. We look forward to after hours, which will be beginning for those joining us. We'll be beginning in about 5 minutes. We're giving these nice gentlemen a break. Thank you so much for joining. We hope to see you at another FAN event soon. And good night, everyone. Thank you so much.